There was only one decisive encounter in round 9 of the Gashimov Memorial, and that came in the game between Fabiano Caruana and Shahriar Mamedyarov. We joined the game after 22 moves, Caruana with the white pieces. It's an endgame, but it's a highly complex position. Most of the pieces are still on the board, and the pawns. It was a Slav. You can see that from this very familiar kind of pawn structure actually here, for example. And Caruana has taken the centre with his pawns, but this centre is under some pressure here. And I quite like Mamedyarov's position. Here, maybe bishop b4 is a reasonable move. I like it when this square is available for the bishop in the Slav. Puts a bit more pressure on this pawn. That's possible. It's also possible to play g4, and that also strikes at this pawn chain and makes sense of the rook. And then maybe, you could follow up later on with bishop b4. I'm sure that black has sufficient counterplay in this position. But Mamedyarov, very much in keeping with his style, his personality, he lashed out. It's an extraordinary move. I mean, this really just blows the position apart, because you can't talk in terms of a fixed pawn structure now, because just the whole thing is completely fluid and it's all about piece play. Caruana took this pawn. Now, black could actually just recapture, but then comes knight e4, and that is a bit irritating. Opens up the bishop, so this pawn is attacked. The knight stands quite well on e4. It's a bit irritating, but clearly this was never Mamedyarov's intention. He just dropped the bishop back, hitting this knight, and in that way hopes to get some kind of pressure against this pawn. But Caruana played his next move very quickly. Just dropped the bishop back. It looks very passive, but it just defends the knight. So obviously if that's exchanged off, then that bishop will be fantastic on this diagonal. But it looks very passive, and it seems at this point as though Mamedyarov has pretty good compensation for his pawn. Remember, white's king's still in the middle. Okay, knight e4. And, okay, well that prepares to kind of unravel. Maybe the bishop can come to c3. The knight looks good on e4, but g4, looking to open lines and use the rook on g8. I think it's a good move. Bishop c3, good move. So Caruana beginning to find some security in the middle. Exchange of pawns, and then castles queenside. So the rooks are connected. White's king is still in the middle, and I mean, this is quite a scary position for white to play. King f2 from Caruana. Okay, so he gets his king off the back rank and prepares maybe at some point to connect the rooks, but how much security does the king have? Let's have a look. After the exchange, you can see the lines are beginning to open up. Caruana is still a pawn up, but black's piece is extremely active. And let me give you an example of what can happen if white is careless. Now, rook h7 looks plausible to me because, hits both bishops. But have a look what happens. First of all, we'll exchange and bring the bishop to c5. Now we can see that the king isn't altogether secure on f2, so there's a nasty pin here. Okay, let's play rook takes bishop. And then, well, we could play bishop takes knight, but rook takes knight is really crafty. So we sack the exchange. Now the king is in some trouble here. If it comes up the board, then there's a knight fork. So it goes back. Now the rook is able to hassle the king. And then let's just play knight e5. So the knight hits the rook, blockades the pawn. These pieces are superb. Black is ready to play rook g2 check to knock the king back. And, I mean, black has a tremendous attack here. And you'll notice the rooks are split. That's crucial. So white's coordination is really poor in this position. Black has tremendous compensation. So that's the kind of thing that Caruana has to take care of. Okay, he played bishop e2, very careful move, and threatening just to exchange off pieces. An exchange, and then knight d2. Well, if bishop c5, then rook d1, and that supports the knight. And you can see with the connected rooks, that's a very different situation to the line we just looked at. So okay, knight d2. Well, also a pretty frightening move to meet. This knight is just flung into white's position. There could be a chance to play bishop c5 now. Knight takes pawn check, obviously is threatened. Not easy. If the king comes forward, then there's bishop g5 check. That's certainly not good for white. So, understandably, Caruana hacked off the knight. He needs to trade pieces. Black's still looking very active. The rook threatens the pawn, also threatens the bishop. I mean, there's only one way to save both pieces, king e3, but I mean this king is staggering around in the middle of the board, and now bishop c5 looks terrifying. I mean, to sort of voluntarily go into this line, you have to have real nerves, very strong nerves. But, well, you can't move the king away from the line of the bishop, because this bishop is en prise. Caruana very coolly played bishop c3. Now, there is this discovered check, but then the king staggers up the board, and you can see with these connected passed pawns, the king finds security, and more than that, these passed pawns could actually bring white to victory. So, for example, bishop d6, okay, we could block, and the king is still staggering around, but, well, okay, this one it's probably good for white. Black still has chances to defend, but probably good for white. Okay, so I think Mamedyarov played well, actually. He played rook g3 check, and then he sacrificed the exchange. This is really dynamic. So black is able to take one of the pawns back, and crucially still has the bishop pair, which means this is still not easy for white. If the king comes up the board, then of course there's rook e3 check, and this is vulnerable. So the king had to come back. So the rooks still split. Not easy. Bishop c4. Still lots of pressure. Only move, rook h2 to defend the bishop. And here maybe Mamedyarov missed a big move. Bishop d6, hitting the rook. When the rook comes to the side, still has to protect the bishop. Then bishop e5. Now that keeps an eye on the f-pawn. Threatens the pawn on c3, and well, black is extremely well coordinated here. He only needs to pick off another pawn, and well, let's say draw would be within his grasp. I think this is still a very difficult position for white. For example, if king f1, then bishop d5, and there are all kinds of discovered check threats here. But instead, Mamedyarov played rook e5. Now, I still think he's fine, actually. But bishop d6 would have been better. Okay, f6, the pawn goes on. Now it begins to be problematic. There's probably still a way to hold this position by playing rook e6. But, if you're short of time, very difficult to see this. And now, well, if this is exchanged, then, well, we reach something very similar to the game. White is going to pick off one of these pawns, but instead king c7, getting the king off the back rank, and probably black is going to take this pawn, and it should be a draw. Okay, instead, Mamedyarov exchanged. Probably he was thinking he's all right here, but Caruana was able to pick off that a pawn. It's not really possible to defend that. Because, well, for example, if bishop b6, then the rook comes back. And otherwise, this rook is going to come into the game, and, well, black can't hold everything together. Mamedyarov tried this, but now f7, forces an exchange of pawns. So we've got all the pawns on the same side, but of course Caruana has the advantage of rook against bishop. Still not easy to win, but he manages to very carefully make progress. Those rooks still aren't coordinated. But now Caruana hits upon the one weakness in black's position, and he manages to get there. So threat rook f7 to take this pawn off. Mamedyarov manages to defend, and okay, there's a threat to the a pawn. Caruana still playing just really precisely and carefully. And here it goes. The rook is going to come down here. Now, of course, this rook could come back to defend the bishop, but black would soon find himself in Zugzwang after the rook's double on the 7th. So this was how the game finished. And here, actually, Mamedyarov resigned, probably prematurely. He can still fight on. I'm sure he's lost here. But, well, there's still a bit of work that needs doing, actually. Must be lost, though. But I think that shows, I mean, this whole game showed perhaps that Mamedyarov in some ways is really quite demoralised. In the position we started with, you know, there was no need for him to lash out. I always feel that Mamedyarov plays at his best when he manages to temper his natural aggression and just uses it in small doses. But here you can see, well, he was just hacking on. Perhaps would have been successful if he'd played accurately, but he's having a miserable tournament. Seems to me he's got a candidate's hangover. Anyway, that victory of Caruana's sets us up for a great last round. In the other two games, Carlsen played about 100 moves against Radyabov, but never looked like winning. It was ended in a draw. Karyakin and Nakamura had a very interesting game, but that also ended the draw. So we have Caruana and Carlsen on 5.5, Karyakin, Radyabov and Nakamura on 4.5, Mamedyarov way out of it on 2.5. So basically, in the last round, Carlsen will play Caruana. So one of those players, or possibly two, both of them, are guaranteed to win the tournament. I'm thinking back to Zurich, where Carlsen massacred Caruana beautifully with the white pieces. It'll be interesting to see what happens tomorrow.